What's up, everybody? Mr. Fantini here. Welcome back. Now, if you've been watching the news at all lately, you've probably heard some information about the current economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And inevitably in these reports, you often hear comparisons made between now and the Great Depression. Now, this isn't a perfect comparison, but one of the big reasons that we study history is so that we can better understand our current situation and try to make better decisions as a result of that. And so I think now more than ever, it's important that we understand the Great Depression and what caused it. So in this video, we're going to outline some of the main causes of the Great Depression, but first let's establish a little bit of context. Now we know that following World War I, the United States experiences a tremendous period of economic growth in what's known as the Roaring Twenties. Now there's a couple reasons for this growth. For one, the war greatly revitalized American manufacturing, and a tremendous amount of public investment was put into our factories to produce goods for war, but then following the war's conclusion, many of these producers successfully pivoted from producing wartime goods to peacetime goods, things like automobiles and new appliances and time-saving devices that put this new technology to work in the American household. These goods were obviously sold to American consumers, but they were also sold abroad and exported to other countries, which meant that money was flowing into the American economy, which is good for growth. If you remember, the United States was also not involved in World War I in the very beginning. Instead, we were just giving loans to many of the Allied powers, and once the war was over and the Allied powers won, many of them had to pay those loans back, which meant even more money was flowing into the American economy. During this period of growth, there was a high degree of union membership in the American workforce, which meant that wages tended to grow with the economy, which meant that more money was put into workers' hands. And this leads to the last and probably most important factor in the growth of the American economy in the 1920s, the shift to a consumer-based economy. Our economy became very much based on average people spending money and buying goods. A consumer-based economy can lead to tremendous growth, but it only works when people are spending money. And when you live and die by consumer spending, a small economic slowdown can lead to a tremendous crisis, which is exactly what happened in the Great Depression. Now, I like to lay out the causes of the Great Depression using the acronym OCD. O for overproduction, C for the crash of the stock market, and D for the Dust Bowl. So let's zoom in on overproduction. Now, we've already established that following World War I, the American economy was growing year after year after year, and that meant that most producers of goods could count on selling more goods next year than they had last year. This meant that a lot of companies invested in expanding their production. If you knew you were going to sell your goods, then you wanted to make more goods to sell, right? This seems like good economic sense, but many of these producers expanded their production on credit, meaning that they were depending on more income the next year than they had the previous year, which means that even a slight slowdown can cause companies to default on their loans and go bust. The other factor at play in the phenomenon of overproduction is simple supply and demand. Now, we all kind of understand supply and demand intuitively. If something is very, very rare, that makes it more expensive because there's not as much of it. But the flip side of that is true too, that the more of something there is, the less expensive it becomes. This meant that many of these producers kind of shot themselves in their foot by producing too many goods within a particular industry. We saw this perhaps most prominently in the agricultural sector, where many farmers would take out loans or even mortgage their houses in order to buy new equipment or buy more land to increase production. During the war years, the government would buy any food that was produced because you could either feed it to the troops or sell it to other countries who were at war. Once the war ended, demand plummeted and supply increased, which meant that prices went way, way, way down. One of the most famous images from the Great Depression, and it's kind of interesting because we actually see the exact same thing happening now, is images of farmers destroying fresh milk. Now, this seems totally crazy because we know that these farmers were struggling, so why would they be destroying their own product? This was a potential solution used by associations of dairy producers where they would all kind of agree to cut their supply by a certain percentage as a way to maintain higher prices. Now, this kind of makes sense in a purely market sense, but this image kind of became symbolic of the tremendous economic crisis of the Great Depression, where you had poor farmers destroying fresh food while people were going hungry in other parts of the country. It kind of reveals the danger and inefficiencies of this completely unregulated economic system. As a result of this overproduction, many, many companies went out of business and many farmers lost their land. And as we know, that can have a cascading effect through the economy because when a company goes out of business, it not only affects them, but it affects all the workers who worked for them. And on that note, let's transition to our second cause of the Great Depression, the crash of the stock market. Now, as I hope you remember from our series on American industrialization, stock is basically a small share of ownership in a company. And as the company does well, the price of the stock can go up. And as the company does poorly, the price of the stock can go down. But the other thing about stock is that it itself is a commodity, and as a result is subject to the laws of supply and demand, meaning that if more people want a particular stock, the price will go up, and if fewer people want it, the price will go down. Now, the prosperity and economic growth of the 1920s led to steady growth in stock prices. That meant that if you had a little bit of money, you could put it in the stock market and almost be guaranteed that your stock would increase in value. Now, obviously, this encouraged lots and lots of people to invest their money in the stock market, including average everyday people who might just have a couple $100 lying around in savings. Now, because stock is a commodity, this increased investment led to an increased value in the stock. And at a certain point, the value of the stock was caused more by people investing, more by the investment in the stock market than the actual productivity of the companies itself. This created what we call in economics a bubble. And what do bubbles do? They pop. Now, among the economists and high-profile investors of the time period, most of them understood that this bonanza of high stock prices was eventually going to end. And as we approached the end of the 1920s, more and more savvy people realized that at some point, this bubble was going to burst. And that is exactly what happened October of 1929, when a couple big-name investors began selling off their stock, thus triggering a panic where people tried to sell their stocks as quickly as they could before the price fell too low. And according to supply and demand, what happens when there's suddenly a huge available supply of stock to buy? The price goes way, way, way down. In the stock market crash, millions of Americans lost money. Many people lost the entirety of their savings or their retirement. Oh, and by the way, tons and tons of companies went completely out of business. And companies going out of business means more unemployment. But perhaps the craziest part of the crash of the stock market was the closure of many of the nation's biggest banks. Now, as you may or may not know, when you give your money to the bank to put in savings, they don't just lock it in a safe and wait for you to come back and get it. They take that money and they invest it. This is basically what we mean when we talk about finance as a career or something like that. And it's actually theoretically very good for the economy. I mean, if you just take all your savings and you stuff it under the mattress, it's not helping anybody. But if you give it to a bank and they give it out as a loan to somebody else, they might use that loan to start a business, which creates more economic growth. So banks and finance actually keep your money in the economy, which helps it grow. And in the 1920s, many of the big banks would take people's savings and invest it in the stock market because it was almost a surefire way to make more money until the crash. At the time, there were very few regulations for how a bank could or could not invest your money or how much of your money a bank could or could not invest. And so that meant if you had all your savings in a bank and then that bank went out of business, you were just out of luck. Based on the laissez-faire ideas at the time, it wasn't the government's fault that you picked an irresponsible bank to hold your money. And so with all this in mind, picture that you have your life savings in a bank and you hear about the stock market crash. What are you going to do? You are going to run to that bank and try to get your money out while it's still there, if it's still there. And so after the crash of the stock market, millions of Americans rushed to their banks in a panic, pulled out all their money, and put even more banks out of business, which meant that more people lost their money, which led to more unemployment and more disasters. Like you see how these economic problems just kind of cascade into one another and amplify each other. And with that concept of the bank rush in mind, I want to introduce one other economic concept that's really, really important here is confidence. And I don't just mean the confidence that you use to get dates. So much of our economic growth is dependent upon people's trust in the economy. Obviously, after the stock market crash and the collapse of many banks, people didn't trust banks enough to put their money there, and so they did start stuffing their money under the mattress, which further stifled economic growth. Also, when many companies are going out of business and people are seeing their friends and relatives lose their job, they're going to be less likely to spend their money because they might save it knowing that they might be next. And what does that do? That means that fewer people are spending money, which means that companies are making less money because they're not selling as much products, which means they often have to lay more people off, which leads to lower confidence, and down we spiral. You see how these economic issues really, really can amplify one another. Remember what we said about that consumer economy? It only works when people are spending money. And when people don't have confidence in the economy, they are not going to spend their money. Now, as if these first two man-made causes weren't bad enough, they happen to coincide with one of the worst ecological disasters in the history of the United States, and that's our last cause here, D for Dust Bowl. Now, over the previous decades, more and more Americans had been moving to the Midwest, to the Great Plains, places like Kansas and Oklahoma and Nebraska, and they had been plowing up that thick prairie grass, that sod, as a way to plant crops. And during the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had decades of abundant rain, which meant that these farms in the Midwest were being very, very productive and contributing to the economic growth of the United States at the time. Well, just about the time when all this terrible stuff was happening to the economy in the 20s, a massive drought hits. This drought obviously caused thousands of farms to go out of business and thousands of farmers to lose their homes and work. But beyond that, the thing about plains is that they're flat. And so, without any grass or crops to hold that dirt in place, when the winds swept across the plains, it would kick up massive dust storms. I really encourage you to take a minute and Google some of the images from this time period. See these pictures of dust clouds a mile high that could envelop an entire town, and the aftermath of these storms, where sometimes entire houses might be covered with dust, or livestock left outside when the storm hit would be found dead, covered in dust, sometimes with pounds and pounds of dirt stuck in their stomachs. You should also remember that many of the farmers in that part of the country were deeply religious, and as they saw these massive storms billowing across the plains, it really must have felt like the end of the world. For our primary source today, let's look at a description of the Dust Bowl from a farmer in Kansas named Grace in 1935. We keep the doors and windows all shut tight, with wet papers on the sills. The tiny particles of dirt sift right through the walls. 2 different times it has been an inch thick on my kitchen floor. Our faces look like coal miners. Our hair is gray and stiff with dirt, and we grind dirt in our teeth. When we open the door, swirling whirlwinds of soil beat against us unmercifully, and we are glad to go back inside and sit choking in the dirt. We couldn't see the streetlight just in front of our house. One morning, early, I went out during a lull, and when I started to return, I couldn't see the house. I knew the direction, so I kept on coming, and was quite close before I could even see the outline. There were examples of people who were caught in these dust storms and died after getting lost with no visibility. And still others became sick with what was called Dust Bowl pneumonia, which is when people contracted pneumonia from getting so much dirt in their lungs. Understandably, many people tried to flee this apocalyptic scene, and many families picked up and moved west to California, lured by promises of cheap land and plenty. And California was one of the most economically productive regions of the country at the time, but very few of these refugees found success there, because labor, like anything else in a capitalist system, is a commodity. And when there were so many people looking for work, wages plummeted. This negatively affected not only the Dust Bowl refugees, but also Californians who resented these people coming in and accepting lower wages. They derisively called them Okies, because many of them came from Oklahoma. In total, the Dust Bowl created about 2.5 million refugees fleeing the middle of the country. Between the Dust Bowl and the other economic crises of the Great Depression, American unemployment peaked at about 25%, and many of these people wound up homeless, living in refugee camps which were not so affectionately nicknamed Hooverville, after President Herbert Hoover, who seemed either unable or completely unwilling to provide any economic relief to Americans at the time. And this may seem shocking to us now, but remember what period we're talking about. This is laissez-faire, baby. You got to figure it out yourself. The government's job isn't to help out the economy, and if you're unemployed and just lost your home because of a natural disaster, well, I guess you better pull yourself up by your bootstraps and find another way to make money. Unfortunately for Hoover and others in power, this was not a very inspirational appeal to the millions of Americans who were struggling during the Great Depression. And after several years of suffering, it wasn't entirely clear how letting the market run its course was going to solve any of these problems. Pulling the country out of this crisis was not only going to require new forms of action, but a completely new theory of politics, which ultimately arrived with Franklin Delano Roosevelt promising a new deal for the American people. We'll discuss that new deal and how we got out of this mess next time. I'll see you then.